Today we are going to talk about wealth and power through art. In history, even today, wealth has always been closely associated with power and vice versa. As was the case in history, art was usually created by those who could afford to buy or commission it. Therefore, art was usually in the hands of the wealthy and powerful. Power in the sense that people of power usually had the authority to have the money to commission these artworks. And often enough, they showed off to the world in a way that sort of says, hey, look at me. My stuff is more expensive and better than yours. In the following images, I will show you some examples of this art. Starting off, in ancient Rome, we have the Augustus Prima Porta, which was one of the many sculptures of the first emperor of Rome, here, Emperor Augustus. This was a mass-produced sculpture designed to stand at the center squares across the empire to serve as propaganda. With propaganda, Augustus was able to show off his strength through the statue's pose and his source of authority with subtle details of divinity. In this particular statue, it was found at the home of Augustus's third wife, Livia. The statue is a prime example of Roman sculpture, with it standing in the iconic contrapposto pose that so many of the sculptures of antiquity use. However, the statue, like I said, is a prime example of Roman propaganda, and you can really see it in the symbolism of Augustus's breastplate. A lot of its motifs really exudes a sense of glory and magnificence, and the symbolism really represents divine right of rule. We see scenes of Augustus defeating his enemies in the battle, showing a Parthian man returning to Augustus' legionary standards, shown here. We see Apollo handing him victory, and all sorts of divinities. Then, at his legs, another depiction of divinity, Cupid, the son of Venus, whom Augustus' family has claimed descent from. Because the statue was made by marble, and so many of them were made for the empire, these statues not only portrayed the power of Augustus, but his wealth for commissioning these statues in order to portray his wealth and authority over the empire. Next up, we have the Bible Moralises, which is a stunning example of medieval illuminated manuscripts. Supposedly created for Blanche of Castile, here, the Dowager Queen of France, and mother to King Louis IX, shown here, who was also known as Saint Louis of France, for the personal use of the French royal family during the mid-13th century. One of the things that should be noted is that books, especially Bibles, were very hard to make at the time. The printing press was yet to be invented, and so therefore each page in these manuscripts were handmade. Each decoration of each page was done one by one, making the creation of these books very tedious. The man-hours needed and the materials such as the paper to make these books therefore made them very valuable and expensive. Now, taking a look at these pages, you can see why these illuminated manuscripts were so special. In the case of this Bible, it includes images of the royal family, here, as well as gold leaf and other valuable materials fit for royalty and those of power, making the value of this Bible very extraordinary. You see gold leaf here, in the backgrounds of each of these pages. The amount of detail and the sumptuousness of these pages really express the wealth of what went into making these Bibles, the gold leaf especially, and the symbols of royalty as well. Not only does this piece of work give an example of the immense wealth at the disposal of the royal family, but it also shows the power of the royal family. For them to be able to commission the creation of such a work and use it for personal use is quite incredible, and it is because of their power as monarchs of France. They were able to commission the Bible and provide the necessary resources for its creation. Up next, we have the Forbidden City, which is the world's largest palace complex, and shows the great power of the Chinese emperors. Built by the Yongle Emperor, seen here, the third emperor of the Ming Dynasty at the beginning of the 15th century. The palace was built over the site of the ruins of an old Mongol palace, as before the Ming Dynasty was the Mongol Ren Dynasty. The original capital of the Ming Dynasty was in Nanjing, but after a coup, which Yongle took the throne from his nephew, he moved the capital north to the modern-day capital of Beijing. The palace itself is designed based on the core feng shui principles and strict hierarchy. Here we have a layout. The palace is split into two main sections, the inner court and the outer courts, split off right around here. The outer court is where the emperor conducts the business of the nation and where the administrative offices are situated. The inner court is where he and his family live. Each palace is situated based on importance. For the example, in the outer court, the most important building was the biggest. Called the Hall of Supreme Harmony, shown here, it is where the emperor is enthroned and where the important ceremonies are held. Here it is on the map. Behind it are ceremonial temples and a banqueting hall. In the inner court, we start off with the imperial residences, starting off with the emperor's palace in the south, the masculine south, in front of the empress's palace, which is situated in the feminine north. Another one of its principal designs is the river in the inner court and the mountain behind the palace. Based off Confucian and feng shui principles, the river provides coolness in the summer, and the mountain provides shade also during the summer and shelter from the winds during the winter. This palace is not only a great example of great Chinese craftsmanship, as we see here, it's quite luxurious and sumptuous, but also a display of the great manpower of the Chinese emperors who had such resources at his disposal. It was completed in 14 years and required the manpower of 1 million workers. Such amounts of workers, plus the materials from all across the vast empire, give a great example of the great wealth of the emperor and the amount of authority he had been able to obtain such vast amounts of resources. What is more, the size of the palace can only awe visitors and impress upon them the wealth and power of the Chinese emperor. While Europe was developing the Renaissance, China was building these palaces the size of small cities, which was a marvel in comparison to what was being built in Europe at the time. Up next, we move back to Europe with the Medici cycle, a series of paintings commissioned by the Queen Marie of France. Painted by the English-Flemish master Rubens, the paintings are a series of 24 allegories of the French queen, here, who was a member of the wealthy Florentine banking family, the Medicis, who monopolized power in northern Italy and the Papal States. Marie herself was the second Medici to marry into the French royal family, and was married off to the much older Henri IV, shown here, by her father, shown here, the Grand Duke of Tuscany, as a way to broker an alliance between the Tuscans and the French king. This series represents the struggles and the triumphs of the queen's life, starting off with an allegory of her fate and ending with her triumph. Here we see a painting of her arriving in France, and here we see her wedding to the king. Throughout these paintings, we can always see a level of great sumptuousness throughout, as well as deities representing the very much godlike status these monarchs held at the time. My personal favorite is the Coronation in Saint-Denis painting, which is the depiction of her own personal coronation as queen consort. After having been queen consort for 10 years, she was given her own coronation, and we can really see the grandeur being depicted in this scene with the main subject. The queen here being flanked by the members of the royal family, princesses of the royal blood, and her husband watching from the balcony, and Abundantia and the winged Victory, spilling wealth and good fortune over the queen as her crown is being placed over her head. While the real coronation was indeed lavish, tragedy struck the next day with her husband's assassination, which caused great turmoil all across France. This, however, led Queen Marie to come to great power, and she was made the queen regent for her son, Louis XIII, and ruled the nation in his stead. However, despite this, Marie de Medici still had at her disposal a great fortune of not only the French royal families, but of her own Medici wealth, which she invested into her court in France by throwing lavish parties and becoming a major patron of the arts. These series of paintings were among those she commissioned to portray the amount of wealth and power she had at her disposal. These are very large paintings, and vast amounts of manpower were needed to paint these series of paintings, as of course Rubens himself cannot be relied to paint all of them. Moving on, we stay on the subject with France, with Marie de Medici's own grandson, Louis XIV, known as the Sun King. His great project, Chateau de Versailles, is a vivid display of power and wealth in France of the time. Originally built as a hunting lodge for his father, Louis XIII, Louis XIV transformed this backwater into a sprawling estate for himself and his nobles to live in. It was here that he centered his court and the center of power, making the chateau the de facto capital of France. During the early to mid-17th century, France was in a terrible state, suffering from civil war and religious wars. The country's prestige was almost all gone by the time Louis XIV had become king at the age of 4. However, from a very young age, he was often told by his mother, Queen Anne, an Austrian archduchess, that he was a gift from God, and he was chosen by God to rule the country. As a grown man, Louis was filled with the ambition and the notion of the divine right of kings. His palace that he built, away from the intrigues and dangers of Paris, was to serve several purposes. Firstly, was to serve as the eye candy of France, the palace that all European monarchs would look at and try to imitate. It would also serve as the monarch's new principal residence and power base. Due to the raging civil wars at the beginning of his reign, known as the Fronde, Louis XIV always held suspicion of his nobles, and used the palace as a way to house his nobles to keep a closer eye on them. This was one of his ways of centralizing power in France, and thus creating his absolute monarchy. Lastly, the palace was a sign of wealth. The immense size of both the palace and the estate was to show the wealth of France. The famous Hall of Mirrors is a great example. Mirror and glass were very expensive to buy, especially as windows and mirrors. Therefore, commissioning something like this was considered revolutionary and incredibly expensive as a perfect display of power through wealth. And now we are done. However, these structures, statues, and artworks are all great symbols of power, although all very different. Versailles, the Bible, and the Medici cycle are great examples of power from wealth. The Forbidden City is also another example of displaying power through wealth, but it also shows others, such as the autocratic rule by the size of the workforce and the divine relation of the building. Like the divine right of the Chinese emperors, the Roman emperors also show their divine rights through symbolism as well. The Forbidden City and Versailles are also examples of the wealth of monarchs and the resources they had at their disposal, thus showing the magnitude of their authority over their nation to commission such large projects. These symbols of power all come in different shapes and forms, some small, like the Bible, and some large, like the Forbidden City. However, in the end, wealth always displays power very well, because wealth usually lies in the hands of the powerful, and the more wealthy, the more powerful, and vice versa.